Send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Good morning. Good morning, good morning. Thank you. Thank you. I'm back with 100% of my health except for my voice, which is like 70% back. But I appreciate your forbearance this morning, and Natalie has graciously offered to assist with the story, so that will be a great assist here. So it is wonderful to see you all here. I am the Reverend Ned Wight, interim senior minister here at the congregation. I've been out on medical leave for about a month, and I am delighted to be back. There's nothing more boring than the four walls of your apartment when you've been there for a month and not been outside hardly at all. So this is wonderful to be here. I serve with the Reverend Natalie Fenimore and the Reverend Jennifer Brower, who is on sabbatical, and with Nancy Reed McKee, who is at the present moment out at Berkeley at Star King School for the Ministry, where she is a student. So we're wishing her well in her trip out to California. The UU Cafe today, for those of you who might be first-time visitors, please stop by the member desk at the in the lobby and pick up a free ticket for a lunch for UU Cafe, and please join us for that. I warn you that grade 1 will be doing a snail parade in the lobby sometime after the service. So if you see snails, various descriptions, do not be afraid. They are benign and benevolent snails. There will be a reception for the opening of photo requests from Solitary, which is an exhibit in our art gallery, from 1 to 3 today, and you can hear directly from individuals who have experienced solitary confinement and the organizers of the exhibit, Jean Casella, beginning at 1:45, so please join us for that. There's a course coming up on Friday, January 26th, a different kind of Chinese cooking, to learn about foods associated with Chinese culture and how blending fresh herbs and common ingredients can contribute to your holistic well-being. The deadline for registration is this Friday. Please contact Carson Jones. And finally, the newly published Racial Justice Program offerings will give you a review of all of the racial justice programs that are scheduled for this winter and spring. So please pick up a copy of this in the lobby. And now I invite you, as is our custom, warmly to greet one another in this fellowship this morning. Opening words of Nancy MacDonald Ladd. We gather in community every Sunday in a state of conflict for our very souls, a state both expansively hopeful and restrictively confined. We are confined, unfree, contained, because in this culture of division built upon the pain of people at the margins, even the decent people hold our love too tightly. Putting it in boxes, prefacing it with qualifications. I will love you if, I will see you if, and only if, you agree with me, you look like me, you stand like me, you think like me, you act like me, you sing like me, you wear your gender on your sleeve and produce it upon demand. I will love you and will meet you in the sanctuary of our hearts if and only if you give me evidence of your good liberal virtues. We are imprisoned by these ifs and these only ifs. We are confined by the smallness of our loving, even as our souls remind us that we can only get free if we all get free together. May there be more love to liberate us all, and may we keep on today and every day until we find it and share it inch by precious inch with one another and with the world. I invite the Hoyle family to come forward at this time for the lighting of our chalice. Chalice lighting words are printed in your order of service. Please join me in saying these together. We light this chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. This is the faith of the open mind. This is the faith of the loving heart. This is the faith of the helping hands. Together we take care of our earth and work for peace and friendship in our world. And now let us join in hymn number 95, There Is More Love Somewhere. Please stand. Let us remain standing for our words of affirmation and our song of affirmation printed in the order of service. As we say together, love is the doctrine of this congregation. Quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. This do we affirm and covenant with each other. Please be seated.
This is the story of the Children's Crusade. What are we going to do? Asked Martin Luther King Jr. as he sat with his friends at a meeting in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin was trying to lead the black people in Birmingham in their struggle to end segregation. Who will demonstrate with me tomorrow in a brave attempt to end segregation? Who will risk going to jail for this cause? In Martin's day, segregation meant that black people couldn't go to most amusement parks or swimming pools, to public parks or hotels or restaurants. They had to go to different schools that weren't as nice as the schools that the white kids went to. They had to use even separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms. They weren't allowed to use the same bathrooms. Many times there would be no bathrooms or no restaurants, no public accommodations at all. Black people didn't think that it was fair, and some white people agreed with them. But in many places, especially in the southern parts of the United States, segregation was the law. It was a way of life. And if black people tried to go somewhere where they weren't supposed to go, they could get arrested, beaten, or even killed. So in the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King went to Birmingham, Alabama, one of the largest and most heavily segregated cities in the South, the city in which I was born, to bring people together to change the law. The sheriff in Birmingham was called Bull Connor. He was called Bull because he was a tough man. And black people didn't know what Bull Connor might do to them if he caught them protesting. Would he just jail them? Would he put dogs or fire hoses on them? Would he beat them? Would he kill them? Martin Luther King Jr. himself had already been in jail once, and others were afraid to follow him. So Martin, seeing that no one answered his call, tried again to inspire the group. The struggle will be long, he said. We must stand up for our rights as human beings, he said. Who will demonstrate with me, and if necessary, be ready to go to jail for it? There was a pause. And then a whole group of people stood up. Someone gasped to see them, because all the people who stood up were children. The adults told them to sit down, but they didn't. Martin Luther King thanked the children and told them he appreciated their offer, but that he couldn't ask them to go to jail. But they still wouldn't sit down. They wanted to help. That night, Martin talked with a group of close friends about what had happened that day. "What are we going to do?" he asked. "The only volunteers we have are children. We can't have a protest with children." Everyone agreed with that except James Bevel. "Wait a minute," said Jim. "If they want to do it, I say, bring on the children." "But they are too young," the others said. And Jim asked, "Are they too young to go to segregated schools?" What do you say? No. "Are they too young to be kept out of amusement parks?" No. "Are they too young to be refused a hamburger in a restaurant?" No. No, said the others. Then they are not too young to want their freedom. That night, they decided that any child old enough to join a church was old enough to march. Here, that would be anyone 16 and older. The children heard about this decision and told their friends. When the time came for the march, 1,000 children, teenagers, and college students gathered. The sheriff arrested them and put them all in jail. And the next day, even more children showed up. Some of their parents and relatives too, and even more the next day and the next day. And finally, 1,000 children were locked up together in a children's jail until there was no more room for anyone else in that jail. So Sheriff Bull Connor, he had turned loose big police dogs, and he had allowed them to bite people, including the children. And he had turned on fire hoses that were so strong that the force of the water could strip the bark off trees. And he had ordered firefighters to point those hoses at the children and roll them down the street. And people all over the country and all over the world saw these pictures, the pictures of the dogs and the fire hoses and the children, and they were furious. Now the white people of Birmingham began to worry because all over the world people were saying bad things about their town, about them. And even worse, everyone was afraid to go downtown to shop because of the fire hoses and the dogs that might get turned on white people by accident. So they decided they might have to change things. And a short time later, the black people and the white people of Birmingham made an agreement to desegregate the city and let everyone go into the same places together. Today, when people tell these stories, many talk about Martin Luther King, but we should also remember the thousands of brave children and teenagers whose courage helped to defeat Bull Connor and end segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, and the rest of the United States. Sometimes it is the children who will lead us.
The title of the anthem has been inadvertently left off the order of service. It's MLK.
let's join in singing the song that we sing when we send our religious education program participants out to their classes with their teachers. So we sing Rising Up.
We are rising up like the phoenix from the fire, so brothers and sisters, spread your wings and fly high. We are rising up like the phoenix from the fire, so brothers and sisters, spread your wings and fly high. We are rising up. We are rising up. We are rising up. We are rising up. We are rising up like the phoenix from the fire. So brothers and sisters, spread your wings and fly high. We are rising up like the phoenix from the fire. So brothers and sisters, spread your wings and fly high. We are rising up. We are rising up. We are rising up. We are rising up.
On this Martin Luther King birthday weekend, we recall all the ways in which this congregation has worked and continues to work for wider justice, especially in a nation with such a long history of racial injustice. Today's offering will help us continue this long-standing commitment. The ushers will please come forward. I invite you to join me in the responsive reading number 584. 584 at the back of the gray hymnal, A Network of Mutuality, words of Martin Luther King Jr. And we'll read this responsively. You can remain seated if you'd like. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted.
Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can.
We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation.
The foundation of such a method is love.
Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war.
One day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal.
We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means.
We shall hew out the mountain of despair, a stone of hope.
I invite you now to come forward to light candles marking your joys and sorrows, your hopes and dreams, your sorrows and celebrations. And we have 2 candle boxes. Today's meditation is from a collection of prayers for dark people by noted African-American intellectual and civic leader W.E.B. Du Bois. Give us, O God, the gift of human charity. Lead us to know that bad as human nature is and destructive as our passion may be, that most people are always a little better than the worst, always more decent than our rash judgment tries to paint. Give us the humility to realize that few of us put in their places, with their hurts and hindrances and their vision of right. Few of us would do better than they, and many would do far worse. Perhaps God meant just this when he said, "Blessed are the meek." Amen. In 2009, Beacon Press became the exclusive trade publisher for the works of Martin Luther King Jr. and published these under the banner of the King Legacy. As some of you may know, Beacon Press is the Unitarian Universalist Association's very own publishing house. The Beach program here of our congregation has funded it every year to bring more of Dr. King's thinking into public consciousness. And we are proud as UUs to have Beacon Press publishing these important works. What is Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy? Dr. King was much more than a single-issue activist. As a theologian trained at Crozier Theological Seminary and Boston University School of Theology, Martin Luther King Jr. saw connections between and among problems and their solutions. In 1967, the Canadian Broadcasting Company invited him to give a series of lectures named after the Right Honorable Vincent Massey, the former Governor General of Canada. King took this opportunity to outline his thinking about 5 interrelated concerns. What struck me, and I think what would strike any of us, is how prophetic King was, like the prophets of Hebrew scriptures, both predicting the future and lifting up the painful truths underlying the social problems of the day. Impasse in race relations was his first talk. He spoke from his experience as the preeminent civil rights leader of his day, and he commended Canada on their record of racial inclusion, acknowledging that Canada was the promised land for slaves following the Underground Railroad north to freedom. Canada symbolized hope to slaves in the U.S. Now remember that King was speaking in 1967, after violent outbursts had broken out in American cities, rage of rising expectations thwarted. Blacks and whites alike noted striking progress in law and practice between the early days of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 through the Freedom Riders in 61, the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery in 63, and the Voting Rights Acts of 64. But then King said, we entered a period of increasing white resistance. Black people said, voting rights are important, but what about economic opportunity? What about poverty in our communities? What about jobs? And white people said, be patient. We can't move too fast. And then the civil unrest broke out in cities across the country, and white people grew even more fearful, and resistance stiffened. This was the period during which King delivered his first Massey lecture, and his analysis is provocative. He noted the policymakers of the white society have created discrimination. They created slums. They perpetuate unemployment, ignorance, and poverty. He doesn't mean every single white person, but the institutions of business and education and government that privilege white communities over communities of color systematically. The disturbing thing is that these institutions have continued to perpetuate unemployment, ignorance, and poverty disproportionately among communities of color. At the end of his lecture, King raised the truth that underlies his entire argument. And listen to how timely this still sounds. The storm is rising against the privileged minority of the earth from which there is no shelter or isolation and armament. The storm will not abate until a just distribution of the fruits of the earth enables men everywhere to live in dignity and human decency. This is utterly consistent with our UU worldview, grounded in our principles of inherent worth and dignity of every person and the interdependence of life. This affirmation is at odds with all those who argue that the purpose of human society is to maximize the personal wealth of individuals, denying that interdependence is the fundamental reality of human life that truly matters. We've got our work cut out for us. Conscience in the Vietnam War, the second lecture, starts with a justification of taking a stand on ending the war in Vietnam. As you may remember, King was criticized by both white people and black people for speaking out against the war, as if his credentials as a civil rights leader did not qualify him to speak on issues of peace or economic justice. But as our reading says, the garment of justice is seamless. Injustice anywhere is an affront to justice everywhere. As he looked at our government expenditures, he saw the promise of funding to end poverty in the United States fade away as more and more money was redirected what he thought was a misguided war in Southeast Asia. Indeed, King's most profound questions are about those who are most at risk in our warfare and in any warfare: the poor, those caught in the crossfire, those at risk not because they are fighters, but because they find themselves living at the wrong place at the wrong time. And who stands to benefit most from military intervention? Surely not the poor and dispossessed. Indeed, as we have seen in Iraq, as we see now in Afghanistan and Syria, war produces refugees in huge numbers, people pushed even farther toward the margins of survival. Once again, King showed himself to be a genuine prophet. He urged us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies, to look uneasily on the glaring contrast between poverty and wealth. His challenge in 1967 seems as fresh as it is to us today. He said, "With righteous indignation, the new revolution of values will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say, 'This is not just.' It will look at our allegiance with landed gentry of Latin America and say, 'This is not just.' The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. The true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, 'This way of settling differences is not just.'" His stark conclusion rings as true and challenging to us today as it must have to his listeners in 1967. If we do not act, we will surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. We've got our work cut out for us. Youth and social action is the theme of his third lecture. It's disarming to read what he says about me and my peers, for I was a college student in Stanford University in the late time of 1967. Unrest on college campuses was brewing over the war in Vietnam, over university involvement in military research, over in loco parentis policies left over from the 1950s, over the conformity and rigidity of social conventions against which our brave new generation was only too eager to rebel. King hearkened back to the social doldrums of the McCarthy era and noted that the energy and the passion that inspired a new social movement was that of youth. Many of the most prominent leaders in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s were, after all, in their 20s and 30s. They combined a vision for the future they wanted to live in with the discipline of nonviolent protest and resistance. King called for a resurgence of the massive nonviolent civil disobedience, and once he struck a prophetic note. The Spirit is awake now. Structures will follow if we keep our ears open to the Spirit. Perhaps the structural forms will emerge from other countries, propelled by another experience of the shaping of history. We need only think of the growth of the World Wide Web, the movement of the spirit of change in Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, the Dreamers, the movement for Black Lives, today's resistant movement. Change is set in motion, structures emerging from young people and their allies throughout the world. They and we have our work cut out for us. Dr. King's fourth lecture, Nonviolence and Social Change, addressed a widespread concern that challenged the core of King's approach to social change. Could you bring about the scale and magnitude of social change that he envisioned without violence? We're still asking that question today. In 1967, with urban neighborhoods in flames and property damage and looting widespread, the possibility of change without violence seemed remote, quaint, unrealistic, weak. But nonviolence was a core principle in Dr. King's worldview, born partly of his deep understanding of the teaching and example of Jesus, partly of his appreciation of the power and effectiveness of Gandhi's example in South Africa and India, partly of his own experience of the transformative power of nonviolent action in the civil rights demonstrations and marches in the South. His call to massive civil disobedience was not a call to massive rioting or destruction of life or property. It was a call to put bodies on the line in protest against laws, inhumane policies, injustices in all of their ugly manifestations. In the face of injustice, the only choice a moral human being can make is to challenge the injustice and confront those whose intent or indifference makes it possible for the injustice to persist. It was in this speech that King outlined plans for the Poor People's March on Washington and the Poor People's Campaign that became Washington's tent city in the late 1960s. It was his hope that this would be an outpouring of poor people and their allies of such magnitude that the policymakers in Washington and around the country could not help but be moved to action by it, to renew the national commitment to eradicate poverty in the richest nation in the world. I was caught up in this hopeful vision, a vision that survived Dr. King's death in the April of 1968. In the summer of 1968, I decided to go to St. Louis, Missouri, to work with the Presbytery of St. Louis at East Grand Presbyterian Church. This was a small congregation located in the Tower District of St. Louis, a poor urban neighborhood recently bisected by an interstate highway. All the white volunteers were paired with black students from other parts of the country. My partner was Sylvia Jean Allen from Yazoo City, Mississippi, a student at Tougaloo College. We spent the summer working with youth of all ages. We constituted our own little outpost of the Poor People's Campaign, and hope for the children of this neighborhood seemed justifiable. I returned to St. Louis in 2002. A distressed neighborhood had become a destroyed neighborhood. The church was boarded up, as were many of the homes. The nearby award-winning Pruitt-Igoe public housing project had become uninhabitable and had been intentionally demolished by dynamite. The promise of the city of God was not to be realized in that neighborhood, in my lifetime at least. What happened to the commitment to eradicate poverty in America? And what about the dream itself of a vision of a just world of shared prosperity? Did that dream die too? Reverend Dr. William Barber and his supporters are seeking to revive the campaign to end poverty, and King's legacy lives on. We've got our work cut out for us. King's final talk, a Christmas sermon on peace, is built around a core principle that we embrace as Unitarian Universalists. It really boils down to this, King said, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. I love this next part, which he wrote in 1967, which is even more true now. He wrote, "You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom and reach over for the sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen, you drink your coffee in the morning, and that's poured into the cup by a South American. And maybe you want tea, that's poured into your cup by a Chinese person. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hand of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. This is the way our universe is structured. This is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. It's hard to read this without thinking of our own seventh Unitarian Universalist principle, the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And other UU principles jump out from the four requirements that King outlines for peace in this final essay, this final lecture. First, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Our loyalties must transcend our race, tribe, our class, our nation, and this means we must develop a world perspective, which is completely congruent with our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Second, men and nations must embrace the nonviolent affirmation that ends and means must cohere. All must recognize that ends are not cut off from means, because the means represent the ideal in the making and the end in the process, and ultimately you can't reach good ends through evil means, because the means represent the seed and the end represents the tree. Our fourth UU principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, is embedded here. And third, the nonviolent affirmation of the sacredness of all human life. Men and women are children of God, made in God's image, and therefore must be respected as such. Here is our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And fourth, we must believe in the ultimate morality of the universe and believe that all reality hinges on moral foundations. Our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. For King, all four of these fundamentals were rooted in love. New Testament agape, understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill toward all people, an overflowing love that seeks nothing in return. It's also what underlies King's unwavering commitment to nonviolence. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. Throw us in jail, bomb our homes, threaten our children, drag us out on some wayside road and leave us half dead as you beat us, use propaganda against us, and we will still love you. We've got our work cut out for us. In these 5 talks, Dr. King reminds us that no matter how great the odds, as people of faith, we are committed to shared values, tied together by our fierce convictions that these values matter, and that we're willing to put our words and our deeds, our minds and our bodies on the line to show others the power and the truth of these values. During the final years of his life, Dr. King saw his dream of August 1963 turn into a nightmare as murders of black children and adults continued in the South, as poverty persisted and worsened, as troop levels in Vietnam exceeded 500,000 American soldiers. Yet in the face of all of this, he maintained a place of honor in his mind and in his faith for the dream of a world at peace, and a world where all the prophecies of enemies reconciled and justice flowing down like water and lion and lamb lying down together and peace on earth, goodwill among all people would be real on planet Earth. Are we capable of dreams that bold? Is our faith capable of sustaining us through the nightmare of our own times to a future when our dreams may yet flourish? Is our community strong enough to inspire and energize us to proclaim our cherished values and principles with our lips and in our lives? I think it is. I think it must be. For that is our calling as people of this Unitarian Universalist faith, we embrace, a faith every bit as powerful as Dr. King's faith and every bit as transformational for the world if we are as bold as he in reading the signs of our time, trumpeting our truth, and walking our talk. We've got our work cut out for us. Let's get to it. So may it always be shalom. Blessed be, inshallah. Aho Shanti. Amen. Come and go with me to that land in the teal hymnal number 1018, 1018. Come and go with me. Our closing words from Kathleen McTeague. We breathe the common wind of the earth no matter where we live, who we love, what language we speak. We drink the common water of the earth no matter the color of our skin, how long we live, the coverings we drape on our forms. We follow the common paths of the earth no matter our beliefs, how far we move from home, the gold that we carry or its lack. May we live from these truths, our hearts open to the holiness all around us, our hands turned always toward the common good. So may it be.
Amen.